When working out at the gym, there's a lot of equipment that you can play with, but when you're working out from home, you have to be a little bit more creative in order to get variety out of the equipment that you have available. This can lead to doing the same things over and over in a lot of cases and getting bored and things getting stale with your workout. That's why in this video, we're gonna cover 116 leg exercises that you can do from home. And since we're going to be covering so many exercises, the order is going to be very important. We're going to be breaking the exercises down into primary exercises, secondary exercises, and tertiary exercises. Primary exercises are your big, complex exercises such as squats, where multiple muscle groups are working together at the same time. These exercises are able to be loaded very heavily, assuming that you have the weight available to load them with. Secondary exercises also work multiple muscle groups at a time, but usually not as many as with primaries and can't be loaded as heavily as primaries. An example of a secondary exercise is the split squat. Tertiary exercises isolate a single muscle group and can't be loaded as heavily as secondary exercises. An example of a tertiary exercise is the leg extension. Lastly, since we're going to be covering 116 exercises in one video, we're only going to be covering the exercises themselves. If you want to learn how to most optimally put these together in a workout, you can click the link up in the cards or down in the description. But before we get into the exercises, hi, my name is Ryan Treadaway, founder of TreadawayTraining.com, where we turn skinny guys into jacked men. If you want more information on body transforming training and nutrition topics every Sunday, consider subscribing. First up on our list of primary exercises is the deadlift. The deadlift will work the glutes, hamstrings, spinal erectors, lats, and will somewhat work the calves as well. So basically the entire posterior chain of your body. Using body weight only or using a broom for the technique will very quickly become too easy, if not immediately too easy. So you can add weight to this exercise. You can add weight via dumbbells, barbell, bands, or cables. A quick note to know about resistance bands going forward is resistance bands are great because they're very inexpensive, very accessible, and will allow you to do a wide variety of exercises. But the limitation to resistance bands is that they use what's called accommodating resistance, meaning that at the beginning of the movement, they're not really providing any resistance at all because they're not stretched. But then as you stretch further and further away from that starting point, the weight gets heavier and heavier. And that's perfectly fine for some exercises, but with certain exercises with a limited range of motion, so where you're not moving that far away from the starting point, such as with the deadlift, for example, since your arms are hanging down and they only move maybe a foot or two, you're not going to be getting a whole lot of stretch out of a resistance band. So resistance bands don't really do the best job for those types of exercises, but are still better than nothing. Next up is the sumo deadlift. The sumo deadlift will work the glutes, the hamstrings, the spinal erectors, lat muscles, will somewhat target the calves. So again, that entire posterior chain, and will also target the quads. Again, this exercise will become way too easy very quickly if you're only using that broom for technique or just body weight. So you can add weight to this exercise by using dumbbells, barbell, bands, or cables. If you want to take the next step with your equipment and add a cable pulley system to what you have available, you can actually do that very quickly and very cheaply. And I actually have a video showing you 4 different cable pulley setup options that you can check out up in the cards and down in the description. Next up is the squat. The squat will target your quads, your glutes, will somewhat work the hamstrings, spinal erectors, and somewhat work the calves as well. You can start out with body weight on this exercise, and then once that becomes too easy, you can add dumbbells, barbell, bands, a weight vest, a backpack, or even have another person get on your shoulders to use that as resistance as well. I don't have videos using a person for resistance for any of these exercises because at the time of recording, my wife is 32 weeks pregnant, so there's no way that I would ever be able to convince her to hop on my back for any reason, and I do typically record these videos by myself anyway, so you'll just have to use your imagination on those. Next up is the front squat, which is similar to regular squats, but will put more emphasis on your quads and spinal erectors, but will still work the glutes, somewhat work the hamstrings, and somewhat work the calves as well. You can do this with one dumbbell, which is also known as the goblet squat. You can do it with two dumbbells, or you can do a barbell, bands, cables, a backpack, or a weight vest. Next up are a couple of exercises that kind of blur that line between primary and secondary, and you could bump it to one category or the other depending on what your goals are. The first of those is the hip thrust. Now the hip thrust really only works the glutes, so that's why you might not consider it a primary exercise, but at the same time it can be loaded extremely heavily, which is why you might bump it into that primary category. You can start out with body weight on this exercise, and then you can eventually move on to dumbbells, barbell, bands, and maybe not an extra person for resistance on this exercise. The second of those two is the Romanian deadlift. The Romanian deadlift can't be loaded as heavily as the conventional deadlift, but does still work all of the same muscle groups. It works the glutes, hamstrings, spinal erectors, lats, and somewhat works the calves as well. Again, you can start with a broom just for technique in the beginning, but that will be either immediately or almost immediately too easy. And then you can move on to dumbbells, a barbell, bands, or cables. The first exercise in the secondary category is the stiff-legged deadlift. The stiff-legged deadlift works the glutes, hamstrings, spinal erectors, lats, some calves as well, and is pretty much limited to just a barbell for this particular exercise. Next on the secondary list is the standing lunge, which will work the quads, glutes, somewhat work the hamstrings, and calves as well. You can start with body weight with this particular exercise, and then you can move on to dumbbells, barbell, bands, weight vest, or a backpack filled with books or something. The next exercise is similar to the standing lunge, and that is the walking lunge, which is going to work the same muscle groups. And again, with this one, you can start out with body weight before moving on to dumbbells, barbells, a weight vest, or a backpack. And next we have another lunge variation, which is the lateral lunge. Again, working similar muscle groups as the two before it, and you can start with body weight before moving on to a single dumbbell or two dumbbells, or a bar, vest, or a backpack. Next up is the step up, and it will work your quads, glutes, somewhat work the hamstrings, and somewhat work the calves as well. You can start with body weight on this exercise before moving on to dumbbells, a barbell, bands, a weight vest, or a backpack. Next up is the split squat, which will work your quads, glutes, somewhat work the hamstrings, and somewhat work the calves as well. And you can start with body weight before moving up to dumbbells, a barbell, bands, a weight vest, or a backpack. And you can also elevate your back foot on this exercise to make it even more difficult. And the last exercise in the secondary exercise category is the glute kickback. The glute kickback will work your glutes and somewhat work the hamstrings. You can start out using body weight before moving on to bands or cables, or you could even use a dumbbell if you have the monkey feet, which I reviewed in last week's video. And the last category, the tertiary exercises. The first exercise in the tertiary exercise category is the standing calf raise. This will, of course, work your calves. You can start out with body weight before moving on to dumbbells, a barbell, weight vest, backpack, or using another person. And a quick note on this exercise is if you're just doing this flat on the floor, you're only going to be getting half of the range of motion. So if you have some wood or a stair or a book or a step-up box or an aerobic platform or something that you can elevate your feet with, that'll allow you to get that nice full range of motion and get that little stretch at the bottom of the exercise. Next up is the donkey calf raise, which of course will work the calves as well. And you can use a barbell for this exercise. You can use a weight vest, a backpack, or a partner. And the next exercise is our last calf exercise, which is the seated calf raise. You can use dumbbells for this exercise, a barbell, cables, a weight plate, a backpack, or a partner. Next up, we have the standing hip thrust, which is an isolation exercise for the glutes. And you can use bands for this exercise, or you can use cables. Next up is the cable pull through, which also targets the glutes. And for this exercise, of course, you can use cables since it's in the name, and you can also use resistance bands. Next up is the lying leg curl, which will work the hamstrings, and you can use a dumbbell, bands, cables, or you can even use the monkey feet, which I had previously mentioned, and you can do 2 dumbbells and work both legs at the same time independently. Next is the glute ham raise, which some people might put into the secondary category because you are working both the glutes and the hamstrings, as the name suggests, but it is also an exercise that is very difficult to load, and most people will never go beyond just body weight with this exercise. So as I mentioned, you can start out with body weight before moving on to a dumbbell, a weight vest, or a backpack. But again, it is going to be a very long time, if ever, for you to add resistance to this exercise. Next up is the standing leg curl, which will also work the hamstrings, and you can use bands for this exercise, cables, or a dumbbell with the monkey feet. Next is standing hip abductions, which, as the name implies, will work your hip abductors. You can use bands for this exercise, you can use cables, you can use a dumbbell by holding a dumbbell in your hand and just holding it against the outside of your leg, or you can use the monkey feet and attach a dumbbell to your shoe. Next is standing hip adductions, which, as the name implies, will work your hip adductors and can be performed with bands or cables. Next up is leg extensions, which will work your quads. You can start off with body weight, which will quickly become too easy, and then you can move on to a single dumbbell by placing a dumbbell between your feet. You can put a weight plate on top of your feet. You can use cables, you can use bands, or you can do 2 dumbbells with the monkey feet attachments. There are also slight tweaks that you can use with each of these exercises to get even more variety, such as using accentuated eccentrics. Accentuated eccentrics simply means that you slow down the negative phase of each rep, which, when applied correctly, can have some muscle growth benefits. And another option would be blood flow restriction training, which can be applied to any of these exercises, and is something that I have talked about in a previous video, and you can check that out up in the cards and down in the description as well. Boom. That just effectively tripled the amount of exercises that we've talked about so far if you include these tweaks. So that's 348 exercises that you can do from home. If you have any great leg exercises that I didn't cover in this video, help out your fellow lifters and leave those exercises down in the comments. If you want to learn how to make your own cable pulley system, click this video. If you want to learn more about blood flow restriction training, click this video. As always, God bless you and your family, and we'll see you next week.